Thunder hurled itself against the Arizona night as though heaven itself sought to crack the parched earth below. Rain lashed the weathered boards of Claire Thornton's isolated cabin with the fury of forgotten gods, each drop striking like molten silver in the sporadic flashes of lightning that turned darkness to harsh blue-white day. The storm had swallowed the distant Dragoon Mountains hours ago, leaving nothing but a world of sound and fury beyond the cabin's thin walls. The Apache called nights like these Gaheye Bini, spirit nights, when old souls wandered the valleys seeking what they had lost in life. Claire sat beside her stone fireplace, 32 years old, but with eyes that had witnessed enough sorrow for twice those years. Her fingers worked mechanically at the mending in her lap, the needle catching occasional glints from the hearth fire as it darted through the fabric. A faded daguerreotype hung above the mantel. A younger Claire beside a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a serious mouth. Thomas Thornton stared out from the frame with the quiet dignity that had characterized him in life forever, 36 forever, watching over the home he'd died defending. The first pounding on her door wasn't thunder. Claire knew the difference immediately. Too rhythmic, too desperate. 3 heavy blows, followed by silence. Her hand stilled the needle poised mid-stitch as she listened. Another blow against the door, weaker this time, then the unmistakable sound of a body collapsing on her porch. Claire reached for the shotgun that never left her side, Thomas's final gift in a land where kindness was scarce and danger constant. She moved to the door with the cautious grace of a woman who had learned the hard way that hesitation and recklessness alike could be fatal. 5 years alone on this unforgiving frontier had taught her to treat every unexpected visitor as a potential threat. She pulled the door open just enough to peer outside, shotgun barrel steady in her hands. There, on her weathered porch boards, lay a man face down in a spreading pool of blood that diluted and swirled away in the relentless downpour. His hat had fallen aside, revealing dark hair plastered to his skull. One hand was outstretched toward her door, fingernails broken and caked with what might have been dirt or dried blood, as though he'd clawed his way to her doorstep with the last of his strength. "Ain't it curious?" Claire murmured to herself. "How trouble always finds its way to my door." Her voice, unused to anything but occasional conversations with livestock or the ghosts of memory, sounded strange in her own ears. She should shut the door, leave him to the storm and whatever fate had been hunting him. She had enough problems without inviting a dying stranger's troubles into her home. But something in the man's desperate posture, the way he'd fought to reach her door before collapsing, stirred a memory she couldn't ignore. Thomas would have helped him. Thomas with his stubborn belief that mercy never diminished the giver. The thought was like a physical pain, a wound that 5 years had failed to properly heal. "Damn you, Thomas, and your voice in my head," Claire muttered, setting the shotgun against the wall. She stepped into the rain, the cold water instantly soaking through her thin cotton dress. The man was heavy-set, but lean with muscle, dressed in trail-worn clothes that spoke of hard travel and harder living. His face was obscured by mud and several days' growth of beard, but she could see a bullet wound in his left side, where blood still pulsed weakly, and another wound that creased his temple. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark relief. A bleeding stranger at her doorstep, a woman standing over him with fury and compassion warring on her face, and all around them the vast, indifferent wilderness that had claimed so many lives before, and would claim countless more in the years to come. With a muttered curse, Claire grabbed the man beneath his arms and dragged him inside, calling on strength born from years of working the land alone. She kicked the door shut against the howling wind and heaved the stranger onto her kitchen table. The same table where they'd laid Thomas 5 years ago, his chest riddled with bullets, and his eyes already fixed on a horizon none of the living could see. "You'd better be worth the trouble," she told the unconscious man as she cut away his shirt with practiced movements. "Because trouble's surely what you're bringing me." The bullet had passed clean through his side. a lucky thing in a place 3 days' hard ride from the nearest doctor. Claire worked methodically, cleaning and stitching the wound as she'd done for injured livestock, and occasionally for herself. The man remained unconscious, occasional groans escaping his lips, but he never fully woke. His torso was a map of old violence. Knife scars, another bullet wound long, healed the kind of marks that told a story Claire wasn't sure she wanted to read. When she'd bandaged both his side and the graze on his temple, Claire dragged him to the small second room that had once been meant for children. Children that Thomas had wanted and that fate had denied them. She covered him with a worn quilt that still smelled faintly of lavender from the last time she'd hung it in the sun, checked that his breathing was steady, then returned to the main room. She lifted her shotgun and settled into the rocking chair near the fire, the weapon across her lap prepared for a night of vigilance. Experience had taught her that wounded men could be the most dangerous of all, especially when they woke disoriented in strange surroundings. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the land, but inside the cabin, an even more dangerous tempest had already begun to brew. Morning broke clear and merciless across the Sonoran desert, the storm having scrubbed the sky to a harsh, unforgiving blue that promised heat without respite. Claire had dozed fitfully, waking at every creak of the cabin's timbers, every groan from her unexpected guest. She rose stiffly, muscles protesting the night spent in the chair, and moved to check on the stranger. He was burning with fever now, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing labored. Claire dampened a cloth and placed it on his forehead, studying his face in the morning light. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with features that might have been handsome before hardship had carved them into something harsher, more dangerous. Not a farmer's face or a merchant's, but a fighter's. All sharp angles and watchful even in unconsciousness. His hands were calloused like a working man's, but there was something about them that spoke of violence rather than honest labor. A gunman's hands should have left you to the coyotes. Claire said quietly, but her actions belied her words as she carefully changed his bandages. For 3 days, the stranger hovered between life and death, his fever raging, as infection fought against his body's attempts to heal. Claire tended him with the same grim determination she brought to every task, forcing water and broth between his cracked lips, changing his bandages, and bathing his face when the fever burned hottest. When she wasn't tending to him, she kept up with her endless chores, checking fence lines, tending her small herd of cattle, working in her garden that struggled against the unforgiving climate, but yielded enough to sustain her. On the third night, as she sat beside his bed, wringing out a fresh cloth to place on his forehead, his eyes suddenly opened. They were a startling, rain-washed blue against his sun-darkened skin, and they fixed on her with an intensity that made her reach instinctively for the knife at her belt. "Where am I?" he rasped, voice broken from days without proper use. Claire held his gaze steadily, her hand remaining on the knife. "My cabin. You showed up half dead on my porch 3 nights back. Took a bullet through your side and another across your head." The man closed his eyes briefly, as if searching his memory for confirmation. When he opened them again, the intensity had softened slightly, replaced by wariness and a hint of something else. Respect, perhaps. "Why'd you help me?" He asked the question genuine rather than challenging. Claire's mouth tightened. "Moment of weakness," she answered, rising from her chair. "You got a name." The man hesitated just long enough to tell Claire whatever came next wouldn't be the truth. His eyes darted to the window, then back to her face, measuring her in some internal calculation she couldn't decipher. "John," he finally said. "Just John." Claire nodded, unsurprised by the obvious alias. "Well, just John, I'm Claire Thornton. You're on my land, and you'll follow my rules while you're here. First rule is you don't bring trouble to my door." She paused, fixing him with a hard stare. "You running from something I need to know about?" John's expression revealed nothing, but his hand moved slightly toward his hip, where Claire assumed a gun would normally be. It was the instinctive movement of a man used to relying on his weapon, and it told her more than his words ever could. "Nothing that should follow me here," he said carefully. "I can move on once I'm able." Claire studied him for a long moment. There was something in his voice, a quality she couldn't quite place, but that stirred an odd sense of familiarity. "Rest now," she finally said, turning toward the door. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." She left the room, closing the door firmly behind her, unable to shake the feeling that she'd just made a terrible mistake. Or perhaps a decision that would change everything. Days stretched into a week, and John grew stronger. He proved to be a surprisingly undemanding guest, never complaining about pain or discomfort, accepting her basic care with a quiet gratitude that surprised her. When he was finally able to sit up, then stand, he began to insist on helping with small tasks around the cabin, his movements growing steadier each day. Claire maintained her wariness, keeping her shotgun always within reach. But she couldn't deny a certain comfort in having another pair of hands around the place, even injured ones. The solitude that had been both her shield and her prison for 5 long years was subtly altered by John's presence. Not broken exactly, but shifted into something different, something she wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. They settled into an uneasy coexistence, speaking little, but working together with increasing coordination. There was a carefulness to John that Claire hadn't expected. He moved around her home, as though conscious of being an intruder, never assuming, always asking before touching her belongings. On the 10th day after his arrival, as they sat on her porch, in the cool of the evening, watching the setting sun transform the distant mountains into molten gold, John finally broke the silence that had characterized most of their interactions. "This is good land," he observed, looking out over the fields Claire had managed to cultivate despite the harsh conditions. "Must be hard working it alone." There was no pity in his voice, only recognition, as though he understood what it meant to face impossible odds day after day. Claire's hands stilled in their mending. "I manage," she said shortly. John glanced at her, then back at the land. "I can see that." Most would have given up. Something in his tone made Claire look at him more closely. "People have tried to convince me to give up," she said carefully. John's expression darkened slightly, his eyes narrowing against the setting sun. "Baron Harland," he said, and it wasn't a question. Claire felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "You know of him?" John's mouth tightened. "Know of men like him. They're the same everywhere. See something they want, take it whatever way they can." His voice had hardened, and Claire caught a glimpse of something dangerous beneath his careful exterior. A banked rage that reminded her of lightning hidden within storm clouds. "He's been trying to buy me out for years," she said after a moment, surprising herself with the admission. "Offers keep getting lower, threats keep getting higher. Says a woman has no business trying to work land like this alone." She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about the gathering darkness and John's quiet presence loosened her usually guarded tongue. "Harland owns most of the water rights in 3 counties now," she continued. "Every small ranch that fails, he's there to pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar. The drought's made it worse. 6 families have sold out in the last year alone." John was silent for a long moment, his profile harsh against the darkening sky. "You had someone before," he finally said. "A husband." Claire nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Thomas." She said the name still painful after all these years. "He was murdered 5 years ago. 3 men rode onto our land, said they were just passing through and needed water for their horses. Thomas was always generous that way." She paused, the memory sharp and clear, despite the passing years. "While he was showing them to the well, they shot him. Took his watch, his gun, and a silver locket he always wore. Nothing else." She gave a bitter laugh. "They didn't even bother with the house. Just killed him and rode off." John's face had gone very still, his body tense beside her. "They were never caught?" Claire shook her head. The sheriff said he'd look into it. 2 weeks later, Harlan made his first offer to buy the land. Said it was dangerous for a woman alone out here. She met John's eyes directly. That's when I knew. John looked away, first his gaze returning to the darkening land. "You stayed anyway," he said, and there was something like admiration in his voice. "This land is all I have left of him," Claire said simply. "I won't be driven from it." The next morning, Claire woke to find John already outside, attempting to repair a section of her fence that had been sagging for months. His movements were still careful, his side clearly paining him, but his determination was evident. Claire brought him water and stood watching him work for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. John looked up, squinting against the already brutal sun. "I owe you," he replied simply. Claire shook her head. "I didn't help you expecting payment." John drove another post into the ground with more force than necessary. "Maybe I need to feel useful," he said, not meeting her eyes. Claire studied him for a moment. There was something about his intensity, the careful precision with which he moved, that spoke of a man accustomed to violence, but trying to channel that capacity into something constructive. "You're running from something bad," she stated plainly. It wasn't a question. John's hands stilled on the fence post. "Yes," he admitted after a pause. Claire nodded, unsurprised. "I don't need to know what it is," she said. "But I need to know if it's going to bring trouble to my door." John finally looked at her, his blue eyes serious in his weathered face. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he said slowly. "Been part of things that haunt me. But what I'm running from now is a man who thinks he owns me, because he once paid for what I can do with a gun." He hesitated, then continued. "I decided I didn't want to be that man anymore." He didn't take kindly to my retirement plans. Claire absorbed this, noting what he wasn't saying as much as what he was. A hired gun, then. A man who killed for money. She should feel revulsion, should tell him to leave as soon as he was able. Instead, she found herself nodding. "We all have pasts," she said finally. "It's what we do now that matters." Something flickered in John's eyes, something like surprise or perhaps pain. He looked away quickly. "That's a generous way of seeing things," he said quietly. Claire shrugged. "Finish the fence if you want," she said. "But don't tear your stitches. I don't fancy putting you back together again." She turned and walked back toward the house, aware of his eyes following her, aware too of a confusion in her own heart that she hadn't felt in years. 2 weeks passed, and John's presence gradually shifted from intrusion to something approaching comfort. He worked alongside Claire during the days, his strength returning his skills with both repairs and livestock, proving unexpectedly valuable. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing sparse conversation that grew incrementally less guarded. He told her fragments of his past. Growing up in Texas, drifting west after the war, taking whatever work came his way. She spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her journey west with Thomas, when they were newly married, the dreams they'd had for the land. Neither spoke of the shadows in their stories, the violence in his, the grief in hers. But the spaces between their words held those truths nonetheless. Claire found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noting the careful efficiency of his movements, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, and the rare occasions when his guard dropped enough for a genuine smile to transform his features. There was a loneliness about John that mirrored her own, though they carried their burdens differently. One evening, as they finished the supper Claire had prepared, John reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he extracted a handful of seeds, holding them out to Claire. "Found these in a trading post outside Tucson last year," he said. "Supposedly from plants that bloom even in the worst drought. Thought they might do well here." Claire took the seeds, rolling them between her fingers. It was a small gesture, but the thoughtfulness of it caught her off guard. No one had given her anything in years. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling rusty with disuse. "We can plant them tomorrow if you'd like." John nodded, a brief smile, softening his features before his usual watchfulness returned. That night, Claire placed the seeds carefully in a small jar beside her bed, a tangible reminder that she was no longer completely alone. Their fragile peace was shattered 3 days later. The morning Barrett Harlan's men arrived. Claire was in her vegetable garden, John nearby repairing a broken hoe handle. The sound of approaching horses pulled them both upright, John's hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. 3 riders appeared on the dusty track that led to Claire's cabin, their manner casual, but their eyes sharp and assessing. Claire recognized William Garrett Harlan's foreman, a lean, hard-faced man with eyes like chips of flint and a smile that never reached them. The other 2 were strangers to her, but their type was familiar enough: hired muscle with dead eyes and well-worn holsters. John moved to stand slightly in front of Claire, his posture deceptively relaxed, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. "Stay back," he murmured. "Let me handle this." Claire ignored him, stepping forward as the riders pulled up in front of them. "Garrett," she acknowledged coldly. "Baron Harlan sent you to make another insulting offer." Garrett's thin mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "Mrs. Thornton," he drawled, removing his hat with mocking courtesy. "Always a pleasure. The Baron simply asked me to check on your welfare. Being neighborly, you understand." His gaze shifted to John, eyes narrowing as they took in the stranger's stance and bearing. "I see you found yourself some help. Interesting, considering how you've always insisted you can manage alone." There was an insinuation in his tone that made Claire's face heat with anger. "My business is my own, Garrett. You can tell Harlan I'm managing just fine, same as always." Garrett dismounted slowly, deliberately, his spurs jingling in the dirt. The other 2 men remained mounted hands, resting casually near their weapons. "Thing is, Mrs. Thornton." Garrett continued, walking a few steps closer. "The Baron's concerned about your water situation. This drought's been hard on everyone." His eyes glittered with malice. "He mentioned your well might be running a bit low." The threat was barely veiled, and Claire felt John stiffen beside her. "My well is fine," she said flatly. "Now state your business or get off my land." Garrett's false smile disappeared. "The Baron's offer still stands. $500 for the whole spread. It's more than fair considering." Claire laughed, the sound harsh in the still morning air. "Considering what, that my land sits on the best water source in the county, that my soil actually grows something besides rocks and scrub. Tell Harlan he can keep his money. This land isn't for sale, not to him, not to anyone." Garrett's face hardened, and he took another step closer. "A woman alone out here," he said softly, menacingly. "All sorts of accidents can happen." Before Claire could respond, John moved so quickly she barely saw it happen. Suddenly, he was between her and Garrett, so close that the foreman was forced to step back. "She's not alone," John said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made even Claire shiver. "And you'd be smart to remember that." Something passed between the 2 men, a moment of recognition that Claire couldn't decipher, but that changed the atmosphere instantly. Garrett's hand hovered near his gun, but something in John's stance and the cold assessment of his blue eyes made him reconsider. The moment stretched taut with violence before Garrett forced another smile. "Just passing along a message," he said, backing toward his horse. "Baron's a patient man, but patience has its limits." He mounted again, gathering his reins. "We'll be seeing you again real soon, Mrs. Thornton." He tipped his hat mockingly. "And your friend, too." The 3 riders wheeled their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Claire released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. John's eyes remained fixed on the retreating riders until they disappeared over the rise. When he turned to her, his face was set in hard lines she hadn't seen before. You know him. Claire said not a question, but a certainty based on the tension she'd witnessed between the two men. John's jaw tightened. I've crossed paths with men like him before. That's not what I asked, Claire pressed. John was silent for a moment, then nodded once. Yes, I know him. By reputation, mostly. And he's dangerous. More than you know. John looked at her directly. They'll be back, Claire. And next time they won't just threaten. Claire nodded. They always come back, she replied. But usually they just threaten and leave. Having you here changed the equation. She studied him. You know more than you're saying. John's gaze dropped. I know men like Harlan don't accept no from anyone, especially not a woman. He looked back at her. I've seen what happens to people who stand in his way. Claire felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, not for herself, but for what was coming. I've held them off for 5 years, she said. I'm not giving up now. John looked at her, something like admiration mixing with concern in his eyes. Then we'd better prepare, he said grimly. Because they won't just threaten next time. That night, as they sat before the fire, the atmosphere between them had shifted, the easy companionship of recent days, replaced by a charged tension. John cleaned Claire's shotgun with practiced hands, his movements efficient and familiar, in a way that spoke of years of experience with firearms. Claire watched him, a question that had been building since Garrett's visit, finally finding voice. You said you were running from someone who paid for what you can do with a gun, she said quietly. Who were you running from, John? His hands stilled momentarily on the shotgun barrel, then resumed their careful work. Does it matter? He asked, not looking up. Claire leaned forward in her chair. It might, if it has anything to do with what's happening here. John was silent for a long time, reassembling the shotgun with meticulous care before finally meeting her eyes. I worked for a man in Texas, he said eventually. Did jobs for him for nearly 10 years. The kind of jobs decent men turn down. He set the shotgun aside, his eyes reflecting the dancing firelight. Eventually, I couldn't stomach it anymore. Told him I was done. He didn't take it well. Claire waited, sensing there was more. John's eyes grew distant. He sent men after me. I dealt with them. Then he sent more. He gestured to his now healed wounds. That's who put these holes in me. I've been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of whoever comes next. Claire absorbed this. And this man in Texas? She said carefully, he has no connection to Baron Harland. Something flickered across John's face, too quick for her to interpret. No, he said firmly. No connection. Harland is your problem, not part of mine. Claire nodded slowly, not entirely convinced, but willing to accept his answer for now. Tomorrow, she said, we should check the well. If Garrett was making specific threats about our water, I want to know why. Dawn found them at the well. John drawing up the first bucket of the day. His expression darkened as he examined the water, then held it out for Claire to see. The normally clear liquid was clouded with an oily sheen on its surface. Poisoned, John said grimly. Not enough to kill, but enough to make you sick. Make the land untenable. Claire's hands clenched into fists at her sides, rage building in her chest. They must have done it yesterday after they left, or sent someone back. John nodded, already moving toward the well's mechanism. We need to clean it out completely. It'll be a full day's work, and we'll need to bring water from the creek until it's done. He glanced at her, his expression serious. This is just the beginning, Claire. They're testing how far they can push. Claire met his gaze steadily. Then they'll learn I don't push easily, she replied, already rolling up her sleeves. They worked together through the brutal heat of the day, emptying the well bucket by bucket, scrubbing the stone sides, refilling it with fresh water they hauled from the distant creek. By nightfall, they were exhausted, filthy, and parched. But the well was clean again, As they sat on the porch cooling in the evening breeze, John broke the comfortable silence. "You never told me why this land matters so much to you," he said. "Why fight so hard when you could take Harlan's money and start somewhere new, somewhere easier?" Claire looked out over the darkening landscape, the silhouettes of the mountains black against the indigo sky. The question touched on something deep within her, a truth she rarely articulated, even to herself. "Thomas and I came here with nothing," she said softly. "Everyone said we were fools, that nothing would grow in this soil, that the water would dry up, that we'd be dead or gone within a year. We proved them wrong. Every crop, every fence post, every brick in that chimney we placed together." Her voice caught slightly. "People don't understand what it means to build something from nothing. To watch seeds you planted push through impossible soil. To see a home rise from empty land." She paused. "The Apache have a name for this valley. Tsei Hahudzo, the place where the stones weep. They say the rocks themselves hold memories, that the land remembers those who have loved it." She looked at John directly. "When they killed Thomas Harlan, thought I'd run. But this land has Thomas's blood in it, now his sweat is dreams. I'll die before I let them take it." John was silent for a long moment. He must have been quite a man. He finally said, his voice strangely rough. Claire nodded, unexpected tears pricking at her eyes. "He was the best man I've ever known," she said simply. John looked away, his profile harsh in the fading light. "I'm sorry you lost him." He said the words seemingly inadequate, but heavy with a sincerity that surprised her. Claire studied him, seeing not for the first time the contradictions in the man beside her. The capacity for violence in his hands, alongside a gentleness she hadn't expected, the wariness in his eyes, alongside moments of unexpected kindness. "So am I," she replied softly. In the days that followed, Harlan's men made their presence increasingly felt. Fence posts were torn down overnight. Claire's small herd of cattle scattered across the valley, requiring hours of searching to recover. John found footprints near the barn one morning, clear evidence that someone had been considering arson before changing their mind. Through it all, Claire's determination never wavered, though John could see the toll it was taking in the shadows beneath her eyes, the tightness around her mouth. They established a routine, taking turns, keeping watch through the night, working side by side during the day, to repair whatever damage had been done. Each day brought them closer, their partnership forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. John began teaching Claire more effective ways to defend herself. How to handle a revolver with greater accuracy, how to use her smaller size as an advantage in close quarters. Claire, in turn, shared her knowledge of the land. The hidden springs, the best hunting grounds, the cave system in the nearby hills that could serve as a refuge if needed. One evening, as Claire returned from checking the perimeter, she found John sitting at her table, head bowed over something in his hands. As she approached, she saw it was a small silver object, glinting in the lamplight. A locket. Something about it struck Claire as familiar, a half-remembered detail tugging at her mind. "What's that?" she asked, setting her shotgun against the wall. John started, slightly closing his hand around the locket. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just a trinket." He moved to pocket it, but Claire was faster, her hand catching his wrist. "Let me see," she said, her voice sharper than intended. John hesitated, then slowly opened his palm, revealing a silver locket, oval-shaped, with an intricate pattern etched into its surface. Claire's blood froze in her veins. She knew that locket. Had fastened it around Thomas's neck on their wedding day, had seen it torn from his body the day they brought him home dead. She released John's wrist as if burned, stepping back, her hand going instinctively to the shotgun. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. John's face had gone very still, his eyes watching her with a wariness that hadn't been there in weeks. "Claire," he began, but she cut him off. "And that locket belonged to my husband," she said, her voice rising. "It was stolen the day he was murdered. So I'll ask you once more. Where did you get it? John slowly rose from the chair, his movements careful, non-threatening. I can explain, he said, but Claire was already lifting the shotgun, pointing it squarely at his chest, her hands shaking, but her aim true. You were there, she said, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. You were one of the men who killed Thomas. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Claire's ragged breathing and the distant howl of a coyote. John made no move toward her, his hands raised slightly, the locket still clutched in one. Yes, he finally said, the single word falling between them like a stone. Claire felt the world tilt beneath her feet, bile rising in her throat. The man she'd saved, nursed back to health, worked beside, and God help her begun to care for, had murdered her husband. The shotgun wavered in her hands as nausea and rage battled within her. Why? She managed through clenched teeth. Why did you come here? Was it some kind of sick joke? Did Harlan send you to finish what you started? John's face was a mask of pain, but he didn't look away from her accusing eyes. I didn't know, he said quietly. Not until I was already here, already healing. I recognized the land first, then the cabin. Then you told me your name, and I knew. Claire's finger hovered over the trigger. Then why are you still here? She asked sharply. Why not just leave me behind and disappear for good? John shook his head slowly. Because I couldn't, he said simply. Because what we did that day has haunted me for 5 years. Because helping you, protecting this land, felt like the only way I might begin to atone for what I've done. He paused, pain etched in every line of his face. Because seeing the strength with which you've carried on alone, made me realize exactly what I'd taken from you, what I'd destroyed. Claire gave a bitter laugh. Atone. You think you can atone for murdering a good man, for leaving me alone to fight off the vultures that have been circling ever since? Tears burned hot trails down her cheeks, but she ignored them, the shotgun rock steady now in her hands. Who hired you? Was it Harlan? She demanded. John's jaw tightened. Yes, he admitted. He wanted the land, said to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Claire nodded, a piece of the puzzle finally clicking into place. And the others, the men who were with you? John's eyes darkened. One's dead, killed in a bar fight 2 years back. The other works for Harlan still, a man named Garrett. Claire felt as if she'd been struck. Garrett, she repeated, remembering the foreman's mocking smile, his casual threats. He's been here countless times. Looking at me, knowing what he'd done, her finger tightened further on the trigger, the wood of the stock smooth against her cheek. Give me one reason why I shouldn't pull this trigger right now, she whispered. John stood very still, making no move to escape or defend himself. I have none, he said quietly. What we did was unforgivable. If my death would bring you peace, I'd welcome it. The simplicity of his answer caught Claire off guard. She had expected pleas, excuses, perhaps even an attempt to overpower her. Instead, he offered only acceptance, and in that moment, she saw not the hardened killer who had taken her husband's life, but the man who had worked beside her, defended her shared quiet evenings on her porch. Her hands began to shake again. Get out, she said, her voice breaking. Take nothing but what you came with and get off my land. If I ever see your face again, I swear to God, I'll kill you where you stand. John nodded once, and then slowly placed the locket on the table between them. It should be yours, he said quietly. I've carried it as a reminder of what I'd done, of the man I never wanted to be again. He backed toward the door, eyes never leaving hers. I'm sorry, Claire. He said the words hopelessly inadequate. Not a day has passed that I haven't regretted what happened here. Claire's shotgun remained trained on him as he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The night swallowed him, and only when she could no longer hear his footsteps did she lower the weapon, collapsing into a chair as sobs tore through her body. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table, the silver locket before her, a tumbler of whiskey untouched at her elbow. Her mind replayed every interaction with John, searching for clues she should have seen, signs that should have warned her. The gentle hands that had helped tend her garden had also ended Thomas's life. The blue eyes that had watched the sunset from her porch had watched her husband die. The betrayal cut deeper than she had imagined possible, revealing feelings for John she hadn't fully acknowledged, even to herself. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky when she heard the sound of approaching horses, many more than the usual 3. Claire rose quickly, reaching for the shotgun, moving to the window to peer outside. What she saw made her blood run cold. At least 15 riders were approaching her cabin. Barrett Harland himself at their head, his substantial frame unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him rode William Garrett, and behind them came men Claire recognized as the worst sort of hired gunsmen who killed without question for the right price. Claire checked the shotgun, knowing, even as she did, that it would make little difference against so many. She had moments to decide: flee into the hills and hope they didn't burn everything she had, or stand her ground and likely die on the same land as Thomas. It was barely a choice at all. She quickly gathered what she could: ammunition, water, a knife, the seeds John had given her, and stuffed them into a small pack. But as she prepared to slip out the back, she paused. This land was everything to her. Every inch represented years of work, of love, of memory. If she ran now, she would never stop running. Claire stepped onto her porch as the riders pulled up in the yard, shotgun held openly, but not aimed. The morning sun glinted off Barrett Harland's watch chain as he dismounted his expensive boots, raising little puffs of dust. He was a big man, fleshy but powerful, with small eyes, set deep in a face accustomed to getting its way. Mrs. Thornton. He called, his voice carrying a forced joviality that didn't reach his eyes. I believe it's time we concluded our business. Claire didn't move from the porch, the shotgun a solid weight in her hands. There is no business between us, Harland, she replied evenly. There never has been. Harland's false smile slipped slightly. Now, that's not entirely true, he said, walking forward until he stood at the base of her porch steps. I've been more than patient, made more than generous offers for this worthless plot of land. Yet you persist in this foolish stubbornness. He gestured around at the arid landscape. Look around you, Mrs. Thornton. The world is changing. The days of small homesteads like yours are over. Men with vision, men who understand progress, we're the future of this territory. His voice hardened. My patience is at an end. Claire's grip tightened on the shotgun. This land isn't for sale, she said clearly. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. So you can take your men and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Harland's face darkened with anger. You misunderstand the situation, he said coldly. I'm no longer asking. He gestured, and Garrett dismounted along with several others. One of them, a brutish man with a scarred face, began unloading something wrapped in canvas from his saddlebags. Claire's heart sank as she recognized the distinctive shape of dynamite sticks. You have a choice, Harland continued. Sign the deed I've brought with me, take the money, and leave with your life. Or don't. Claire lifted the shotgun slightly, making her own choice clear. You killed my husband for this land, she said, her voice carrying to all the men present. You sent 3 cowards to murder him in cold blood, and now you stand on my property threatening me. If you want this land, Barrett Harland, you'll have to kill me too, and everyone in the territory will know exactly what kind of man you are. A murmur ran through some of the men, exchanges of uncertain glances that gave Claire a flicker of hope. Not all of them had known the full story, it seemed, but Harland's face merely contorted with rage. You stupid woman, he snarled. You think anyone cares about the truth out here? Power is the only truth that matters. He turned to his men. Garrett burns with me. The rest of you surround the place. No one gets in or out. He looked back at Claire, all pretense gone. Last chance, Mrs. Thornton. The deed for your life. Claire raised the shotgun to her shoulder, aiming directly at Harlan's substantial chest. Get off my land, she said softly, dangerously. For a moment, no one moved. Then Harlan nodded to someone behind him, and before Claire could react, a shot rang out. Pain exploded in her left arm as the bullet grazed her, the impact causing her to stumble backward. The shotgun discharged harmlessly into the air as she fell skidding across the porch. Harlan laughed a cruel sound. Bring her inside, he ordered. We'll need her signature before we finish this. And someone set those charges at the well. Once we're done here, nothing will grow on this godforsaken patch ever again. Strong hands grabbed Claire, dragging her back into her own cabin despite her struggles. Garrett pushed her roughly into a chair, while another man, a brutal-faced brute Claire didn't recognize, held her shotgun on her. Harlan entered last, removing his hat with mocking courtesy. And now then, he said, producing papers from inside his coat. This can still end cleanly. Sign here acknowledging receipt of $500 and transferring all rights to this property to me. He placed the papers on the table before her alongside a fountain pen. Claire looked from the papers to Harlan's smug face, despair and rage warring within her. Even if she signed, she knew they wouldn't let her leave alive. Not now, not after what she'd said in front of his men. Her only hope was to stall, though, for what she couldn't say. And if I refuse? She asked, playing for time. Harlan's smile was cold. Then Garrett here will break your fingers one by one until you change your mind. And if that doesn't work, well. He glanced at the locket still lying on the table, picking it up and examining it with feigned interest. I understand this belonged to your late husband. Sentimental value, I imagine. Claire's blood ran cold. How did he know about the locket unless our mutual friend returned it to you, did he? Harlan asked, watching her face closely. John Mason always did have a peculiar sense of honor, even when he was in my employ. It's what made him so effective and so dangerous. Claire's mind raced. Harlan had known John all along. Had he sent John here deliberately? Had their entire interaction been a setup? You look confused, Mrs. Thornton. Harlan continued, clearly enjoying her distress. Allow me to clarify. Mason didn't just work for me 5 years ago when your husband met his unfortunate end. He's been my most valuable asset for nearly a decade. Or he was, until he developed this inconvenient conscience. He turned the locket over in his hands. He was quite broken up about your husband, you know. It was the beginning of the end for him. Started questioning orders, becoming unreliable. Eventually thought he could just walk away. Harlan chuckled darkly. No one walks away from me. Claire's fingers closed around the knife she'd hidden in her boot, her mind calculating distances, odds, possibilities. She might not survive this, but she would ensure Harlan didn't either. Where is Mason now? Garrett asked suddenly, his hand moving nervously to his gun. He should have been easy to track in his condition. Forget Mason, Harlan said dismissively. He's probably halfway to Mexico by now. The man knows when he's beaten. He tossed the locket carelessly onto the table. Now, Mrs. Thornton, about that signature. A gunshot cracked outside, followed immediately by shouts and more gunfire. Harlan's head snapped up, his face darkening. What now? He growled, moving to the window. Claire saw her chance. As Garrett and the other man turned toward the commotion, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and swung it with all her strength at the gunman's head. There was a sickening crack as it connected, and he crumpled to the floor, Garrett spun back toward her, drawing his gun, but Claire was already swinging again, catching him across the forearm. He howled in pain, the gun falling from numbed fingers, and Claire brought the poker down again, this time across his temple. Garrett collapsed beside his companion, blood seeping from the wound on his head. Harlan turned from the window, his face contorted with fury, reaching for his own weapon. "You bitch!" he snarled, but before he could draw, the cabin door burst open. John stood framed in the doorway, a revolver in each hand, his face a mask of cold determination. Blood stained his left sleeve, evidence that he'd already been in the fight raging outside. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. Harlan with his hand on his gun, Claire with the poker, raised the two fallen men on the floor. "Step away from her," John said quietly, one revolver trained steadily on Harlan's chest. The land baron froze, his small eyes calculating. "Well," he said, forcing a smile, "if it isn't the prodigal son. I wondered where you'd gotten to after that business in Tucson." He straightened slightly, hand moving away from his gun with exaggerated care. "Been a long time, Mason. I believe I still owe you money for your last job." Claire looked between them, realization dawning with sickening clarity. John's jaw tightened. "The name's John now," he said flatly. "And the only thing you owe me is the chance to put a bullet in you." Harlan laughed, though his eyes remained cold and watchful. "Come now, we're all businessmen here. Well, except for the lovely widow." His gaze flicked to Claire. "Though I suppose you two have become quite well acquainted. Tell me, does she know everything about your part in her husband's unfortunate demise, about the real reason you were hunting him in the first place?" John's expression didn't change, but Claire saw the muscle in his jaw flex. "She knows enough," he said simply. The light of malicious triumph in Harlan's eyes dimmed slightly. "And yet here you are playing the hero. How touching. I always said you were too soft for this business." He took a careful step sideways, positioning himself to use the table as partial cover. "What's your plan here, Mason? Kill me and a dozen more like me will come. This territory is changing. Men like her husband scratching in the dirt for a living, they're the past. Men like me with vision and the will to act, we're the future." Outside, the gunfire had become more sporadic, suggesting the battle was winding down. John kept both revolvers trained on Harlan, his eyes never wavering. "Maybe," he acknowledged. "But you won't be part of that future." Something in his tone made even Harlan pause, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "You're making a mistake," the Baron said, his voice hardening. "I made you what you are. You think killing me changes anything about you? You'll always be a killer, Mason. Always be the man who shot Thomas Thornton in the back for $50. Claire felt the words like a physical blow, her hands tightening on the poker. John didn't flinch, but something in his eyes darkened further. "You're right," he said quietly. "Nothing changes what I've done. But I can choose what I do now." His finger tightened on the trigger, and Harlan must have sensed his resolve hardening because he suddenly lunged forward, flipping the heavy oak table toward John. In the same motion, he drew his gun, firing wildly as wood splintered between them. John dove sideways, returning fire, even as he moved his shots more measured despite the chaos. Claire threw herself to the floor as bullets tore through the cabin, shattering her mother's china on the shelf, splintering wood and embedding in the walls. A sudden explosion rocked the ground, the dynamite at the well, Claire realized with horror. The shock of it shook the cabin, sending dust and debris raining from the ceiling. A support beam groaned ominously above them. Through the thunder of gunfire and cracking wood, she heard a grunt of pain that might have been Harlan or might have been John, and then a second closer explosion that knocked her sideways. The cabin's structure began to give way, timbers cracking with sounds like gunshots. "Claire," John's voice cut through the chaos, "the roof's coming down." She looked up to see a massive beam tilting directly above her, its support shattered by gunfire or the explosion's shockwave. She scrambled backward, but too slowly. The beam was falling too fast. Suddenly, John was there, throwing himself against her, pushing her clear as the massive timber crashed down. She hit the floor hard, the breath knocked from her lungs, a cloud of dust enveloping everything. When it cleared enough for her to see, her heart stopped. The beam had fallen across John's legs, pinning him to the floor. Harlan lay against the far wall, blood spreading across his expensive waistcoat, his gun still clutched in his hand. His eyes were open but glazing, life already fading from them. John. Claire crawled to him through the debris. His face was pale with pain and covered in dust, but his eyes were clear as they found hers. "Are you hit?" he asked, his voice strained but steady. Claire shook her head, already examining the beam that trapped him. "No, but you're pinned. We need to get you out of here before the rest of the roof comes down." She looked around frantically for something to use as a lever. Another explosion outside shook the cabin again, and more dust filtered down from above. The remaining men were still fighting, and now the very structure around them was becoming their enemy. "Claire," John said urgently, "listen to me. There's no time. You need to get out now." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely, straining against the massive beam. It didn't budge. John grabbed her wrist. "Claire, please. The rest of the roof could go any second. Don't let us both die here." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a connection that transcended the betrayal and pain of their shared past. "I'll find help," Claire said, her voice breaking. "I'll be right back." John nodded, releasing her wrist. "Go." Claire ran for the door, dodging falling debris. Just as she reached the threshold, another explosion closer than the others rocked the cabin. She was thrown forward onto the porch as part of the roof collapsed behind her. "John," she screamed, turning back, but a wall of dust and debris now separated them. Outside, the scene was chaos. Several of Harlan's men lay dead or wounded in the yard. Others were engaged in a fierce gun battle with figures taking cover behind rocks and outbuildings men Claire didn't recognize. One of them spotted her and called out, "Get down!" Claire dropped to the porch floor as bullets whizzed overhead. The man who had warned her darted forward in a crouching run, reaching her side and pulling her behind a water barrel for cover. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his weathered face concerned beneath a battered hat. "The cabin's collapsing." Claire gasped. "John's trapped inside. We have to help him." The man nodded grimly. "Morgan," he yelled to someone Claire couldn't see. "Mason's still in the house. It's coming down." A lean, hard-faced man she hadn't noticed before. Morgan apparently dispatched the Harlan gunman he was fighting with a well-placed shot, then sprinted toward them, keeping low. "Where is he?" Morgan demanded as he reached them. "Inside, pinned under a beam," Claire said. "The back half of the roof is already down." Morgan assessed the situation with quick, sharp eyes. "Cooper, Jenkins," he called to two other men. "Cover us. Everyone else keep those bastards pinned down." He turned to Claire. "Stay here, we'll get him." "I'm coming with you," she insisted, grabbing his arm. "It's my house. I know where he is." Morgan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Stay behind me." They made their way back to the cabin, Morgan leading Claire close behind, and the man who had first reached her bringing up the rear. Inside, the air was thick with dust, visibility reduced to just a few feet. The main beam that had fallen on John was now just one of several that had collapsed. John, Claire called, trying to orient herself in the ruins of her home. A weak cough answered her from the right, and they moved carefully in that direction, picking their way over fallen timbers and debris. They found John half buried under the original beam and additional debris that had fallen after Claire left. His face was deathly pale now, blood seeping from a new wound on his head. "Mason," Morgan said urgently, kneeling beside him. "Hang on, you stubborn son of a bitch. We're getting you out of here." John's eyes fluttered open. "Morgan," he murmured. Should have known. You'd show up. Just in time to watch me die. Not today. Morgan replied grimly, already examining the beam. Claire, check if Harlan's dead. Simmons, help me with this. Claire moved toward where she had last seen the land baron. He lay partially buried under fallen plaster and wood, but his eyes were open and fixed his chest still. She checked for a pulse anyway, finding none. He's dead, she reported, returning to John's side. Morgan and Simmons had managed to shift the beam slightly, but not enough to free John. His legs remained trapped, and blood was now seeping from beneath him at an alarming rate. Claire realized with growing horror that it wasn't just his legs that were injured. Some part of the debris had penetrated his torso. We need more men, Morgan said urgently. Simmons, get... Another section of roof gave way, with a deafening crack cutting off his words. A massive cloud of dust enveloped them, and when it cleared, their exit was blocked by fallen timbers. We're trapped, Simmons said unnecessarily, staring at the wall of debris. Morgan's face was grim, but his voice remained steady. There's another way. Through the back room, if it's still standing. Claire nodded. This way, she said, leading them toward what had been her bedroom. The walls were still partially intact, though the roof was gone open to the sky above. They could climb out through there. Get him free first, she insisted, returning to John's side. Together, the three of them managed to leverage the beam enough for Claire to slide John out from under it. He groaned in pain, but remained conscious, his eyes finding Claire's face and holding on, as if it were his lifeline. You came back, he whispered. Of course I did, she replied, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. Morgan examined John's wounds quickly, his expression darkening. We need to move fast, he said, and the tone of his voice told Claire everything she needed to know. They fashioned a rough stretcher from Claire's bedroom door, laid flat, and carefully moved John onto it. Blood soaked through his shirt at an alarming rate, and his breathing had become labored. Who are these men? Claire asked Morgan as they prepared to carry John out through the partially collapsed bedroom. Friends, Morgan replied shortly. Been tracking Harlan for months. John sent word when he found you, asked us to be ready. Before Claire could ask more questions, gunshots rang out again, closer this time. They're making another push, Simmons said urgently. We need to move now. They lifted the makeshift stretcher, Morgan and Simmons taking the weight, while Claire led the way, navigating through the ruins of her home. They emerged into the harsh sunlight to find the battle still raging, though it had moved farther from the house. Several more of Harlan's men lay motionless in the yard, while others had taken cover behind the barn and outbuildings. Get him to the rocks, Morgan ordered. We'll find cover there until this is over. They moved as quickly as they dared, staying low, using what cover they could find. They had almost reached the relative safety of a rock outcropping when a bullet kicked up dirt just inches from Claire's feet. Another followed closer still. Down! Morgan shouted, dropping his end of the stretcher and drawing his gun in one fluid motion. Claire and Simmons lowered John to the ground, Simmons also drawing his weapon as a group of Harlan's men emerged from behind the barn, firing as they came. Claire threw herself over John's body, trying to shield him from further injury as bullets whined overhead. She felt his hand close weakly around hers. Claire, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. The locket, in my pocket. She reached into his jacket pocket and found it, the silver still warm from his body. I have it, she told him. Open it, he said, his breathing increasingly labored. Please. Claire fumbled with the catch, finally managing to open the locket. Inside was the familiar portrait of herself, but opposite it was not Thomas's image, as she had expected. Instead, there was a small, worn photograph of a young woman with John's eyes and a gentle smile. My sister John explained each word clearly, costing him. Sarah. She died. Consumption. 6 years ago. He coughed, blood staining his lips. Thomas. He found me when I was on a job in Santa Fe. Recognized me somehow. Said Sarah had written to him before she died. Claire stared at the photo, then back at John's face, confusion and shock warring within her. Thomas knew who I was. John continued, his voice fading. Confronted me. Said Sarah would be ashamed of what I'd become. He was right. Another cough racked his body. I took the locket to remember his words. To remember I could be better. Claire's mind reeled with the implications. Thomas had known John before the day he was killed, had tried to reach the man behind the killer, had seen something worth saving when Harland sent us to your land. John wheezed. I didn't know the connection. Not until I saw Thomas. Too late then. His eyes closed briefly in pain. Been trying to make it right ever since. A bullet struck the ground, inches from them, sending dirt spraying over them. The firefight was intensifying around them. Morgan and Simmons were holding their position, but more of Harlan's men were approaching. They were surrounded, Simmons called. Running low on ammunition, Morgan fired again, dropping one of their attackers. Where the hell is Cooper with the rest of our men? As if in answer, a series of explosions erupted from the direction of the barn and the remaining dynamite. Claire realized. Several of Harlan's men were thrown into the air by the blast, and they're scattered in panic. Through the smoke and confusion, more riders appeared, the rest of John's mysterious friends, laying down covering fire as they approached. The tide of the battle turned instantly, Harlan's remaining men throwing down their weapons or fleeing. It's over, Claire told John, turning back to him. They're running. It's over, John. But John's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. The ground beneath him was dark with blood. No, Claire whispered. No. John, stay with me, please. His eyes fluttered open, finding her face with effort. Claire, he murmured. Forgive me. She took his hand, pressing it to her cheek. I forgive you. She said, the words tearing from her throat. I forgive you, John. Just stay with me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Liar, he whispered. But thank you for letting me try to be better. His eyes closed again, his hand going limp in hers. Claire bent over him, sobs racking her body, unaware of the battle's end. Around them, unaware of Morgan kneeling beside her, checking John's pulse. He's still alive, Morgan said, his voice cutting through her grief. Barely. We need to get him to a doctor now. Claire looked up, hope warring with despair. The nearest doctor is in Tucson. 3 days' ride. Morgan shook his head. Doc Wilson's with us. Set up a field hospital in the cave system to the east. It's why we chose today to move on Harland. We were prepared for casualties. He stood calling orders to his men. 2 of them appeared with a proper stretcher, carefully transferring John's limp form onto it. Will he live? Claire asked, rising to follow as they lifted the stretcher. Morgan's face was grim. I won't lie to you, ma'am. It doesn't look good. He's lost a lot of blood, and I suspect there's internal damage. But if anyone can pull through, it's Mason. Too stubborn to die, that one. Claire walked beside the stretcher as they carried John away from the ruins of her home, the silver locket clutched tightly in her hand. Behind them, the cabin that had been her refuge and her prison for 5 years continued to collapse in on itself, timbers groaning as they gave way. She didn't look back. The cave system Morgan had mentioned turned out to be one Claire knew well. A natural formation in the foothills east of her property, with several large chambers that stayed cool even in the summer heat. The rebels had established a surprisingly well-equipped field hospital in the main chamber, with cots, medical supplies, and even a few oil lamps providing steady light. Doc Wilson proved to be a gruff, elderly man, with steady hands and sharp eyes. He went to work on John, immediately sending Claire away while he operated. She sat outside the chamber, the locket still in her hand, trying to process everything that had happened. Morgan found her there hours later, offering a cup of coffee and a worn blanket against the cave's chill. "You should rest," he said, settling beside her on the stone floor. "You've been through hell today." Claire accepted the coffee but ignored his suggestion. "Who are you people?" she asked directly. "Why were you tracking Harland? How does John fit into all this?" Morgan sighed, taking a sip of his own coffee before answering. "We're not outlaws, if that's what you're asking. At least not in the way most people think. Some of us were lawmen once. Some were soldiers. A few were just ordinary folks who lost everything to men like Harland." He stared into the darkness of the cave entrance. "About 3 years ago, we started hearing rumors about land grabs throughout the territory. Small ranchers and farmers being forced out, sometimes legally, sometimes not. Always the same pattern: water sources mysteriously failing livestock, disappearing accidents that weren't accidents. And always the same people benefiting." "Harland," Claire said. Morgan nodded. "Harland and others like him. Men with political connections, men who saw the coming of the railroad as an opportunity to seize control of the most valuable land in the territory. They've been working together, building an empire piece by piece, using violence and intimidation where money and legal tricks don't work." He looked at her directly. "The territorial governor is concerned, but his hands are tied. Many of these men have powerful friends back east. So a few of us decided to take matters into our own hands, gather evidence, build cases that can't be ignored, and yes, sometimes fight fire with fire." "And John?" Claire asked, the locket heavy in her palm. Morgan's expression softened slightly. "Mason and I go way back. Rode together in the war, lost touch after. When I heard he was working for Harland as a hired gun, I couldn't believe it. The man I knew wasn't a killer for hire." He took another sip of coffee. "Found him in a saloon in Nogales about 2 years ago. Half drunk and fully haunted. Said he'd done things he couldn't live with anymore. Mentioned your husband specifically?" Claire's throat tightened. "He told me he'd been tracking Harland's operations ever since, gathering information, trying to find a way to bring him down. Said he owed it to a man named Thornton and the widow he left behind." Morgan gave her a significant look. "When he learned Harland was making another push for your land, he rode out immediately. Sent word to us to be ready." Claire stared at the locket in her hand. "He's been carrying this for 5 years," she said softly. "Carrying the memory of what he'd done." Morgan nodded. "Mason always was the type to torture himself over his mistakes. It's what makes him different from most in our line of work." Before Claire could respond, Doc Wilson emerged from the chamber, wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth. His expression was grim, but not defeated. "He's alive," he announced without preamble. "Lost a lot of blood. Bullet fragments in his side, broken ribs, internal bleeding that I've done my best to stop. Next 24 hours will tell." Claire stood. "Can I see him?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "He's unconscious. Likely to stay that way for a while. But I've seen talking to them helps, sometimes gives them something to come back to." Claire entered the chamber, moving to the cot where John lay. He was deathly pale, his torso wrapped in fresh bandages, his breathing shallow but steady. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said softly, "but I'm here. And I need you to fight John. I need you to live, because I have questions only you can answer. And because—" She hesitated, struggling with feelings she wasn't ready to name. "Because I'm not done being angry with you yet, damn it. And you don't get to escape that by dying." She stayed there through the night, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in silence, never leaving his side. When dawn broke, filtering pale light through the cave entrance, John's eyes finally opened. Claire, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You're still here. She squeezed his hand. I'm still here, she confirmed. My men, he asked. 2 dead, several wounded, but most came through, she told him. Morgan's been checking on you regularly. John nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. Harland, dead, Claire said firmly, and most of his men with him. Relief crossed John's features. Good, he murmured. Then more softly, I'm sorry about your home. Claire thought of her cabin now, likely nothing but charred timbers and scattered stone. The place where she had lived with Thomas, where she had grieved him, where she had fought to hold on to his memory, and the land they had loved. It was just a building, she said, surprising herself with the realization that she meant it. The land is still there. I can rebuild. John's eyes held hers, searching. You're staying then? It's my land, she said simply. Nothing's changed that. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Stubborn woman. He murmured, his eyes drifting closed again as exhaustion claimed him. Claire sat back, watching him sleep, the locket still clutched in her hand. Perhaps nothing had changed about her determination to keep her land. But everything else, everything she had believed about the past 5 years, about Thomas's death, about her own isolated existence, had been transformed in the space of a single day. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of tending to the wounded, salvaging what could be saved from her ruined home, and beginning the slow process of rebuilding. John's recovery was painfully slow, complicated by infection that set in, despite Doc Wilson's best efforts. For nearly a week, it seemed he might slip away, after all his fever raging, his wounds refusing to heal properly. Claire refused to leave his side during the worst of it, sleeping in short bursts on a bedroll beside his cot, waking at his every murmur or movement. When the fever finally broke, leaving him weak but lucid, the relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her shaking. Morgan and his men stayed, helping Claire clear the ruins of her cabin and begin construction on a new one. They were an odd assortment of characters, former lawmen, ex-soldiers, even a few reformed outlaws bound together by their determination to fight the corruption spreading across the territory. As the days passed, Claire learned more about their operation. They had been gathering evidence against Harland and his associates for months, documenting the pattern of intimidation and violence, building a case that the territorial authorities couldn't ignore. With Harland's death and the recovery of incriminating documents from his saddlebags, they finally had what they needed. The territorial judge arrived 2 weeks after the battle, accompanied by a contingent of deputies. He set up a makeshift court in the town of Benson, taking testimony from Claire Morgan and those of Harland's men who had survived to stand trial, including William Garrett. The evidence was damning. Harland's personal papers detailed a years-long conspiracy of land theft, intimidation, and murder that stretched across 3 counties and implicated several territorial officials. Most shocking to the packed courtroom was the letter, 5 years old, but preserved in Harland's meticulous records, specifically ordering the murder of Thomas Thornton and making it appear as robbery. It was signed with Harland's distinctive flourish and addressed to Mason and Associates. When Garrett was brought to testify, he spat at Claire's feet. "Should have killed you years ago," he snarled. "Right alongside your husband." Claire watched him with strange detachment as he was led away to face hanging. The revenge she had dreamed of for 5 long years had finally come, yet it brought none of the peace she had imagined. Instead, she felt hollowed out, as if the rage that had sustained her for so long had left a void in its wake. By the time the trials ended, John was strong enough to walk short distances, though his recovery was far from complete. The new cabin on Claire's land was taking shape, smaller than the original, but sturdier, with stone walls that would better withstand attack should it ever come again. One evening, as Claire sat on a makeshift bench outside the partially completed structure, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, John joined her. He moved slowly, still favoring his left side, but his color had improved, and the haunted look in his eyes had diminished somewhat. "Morgan says they'll be moving on soon," he said, carefully lowering himself beside her. "Now that the trials are done." Claire nodded. Morgan and his men had stayed far longer than she had expected, helping with the rebuilding, ensuring that Harlan's former associates knew the land was protected. She would miss their presence, their rough camaraderie that had somehow come to include her. "And you?" she asked, not looking at John. "Will you go with them?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all that remained unspoken. John was silent for so long that Claire thought he might not answer. "That depends," he finally said, his voice low, "on whether there's any chance I might stay." Claire turned to him, then studying his face in the fading light, the lines of hardship and regret, the blue eyes that watched her with cautious hope and expected rejection. "I haven't forgiven you," she said honestly. "Not completely. I'm not sure I ever can." John nodded, accepting this without surprise or protest. "I understand," he said quietly. "But," Claire continued, "I've come to believe that Thomas would have. Forgiven you, I mean." She fingered the silver locket that now hung around her neck, containing the dual portraits of herself and John's sister. "He saw something in you worth saving even then. And now I think I see it too." John's breath caught audibly. "What are you saying, Claire?" She looked out at the land, stretching before them, her land, Thomas's land, now somehow becoming her own in a new way. The wounds Harlan had inflicted, both physical and otherwise, were beginning to heal. The poisoned well was clean again. The scattered cattle had been recovered. New seeds were in the ground, promising life where there had been only struggle before. "I'm saying that redemption isn't something given or taken," she said slowly. "It's built day by day, choice by choice, like this cabin, like this land." She met his eyes directly. "If you want to stay and help build it, you can." Something that might have been tears glimmered briefly in John's eyes before he blinked them away. "It won't be easy," he said. "People will talk. They'll remember what I did. Let them talk." Claire replied, a new strength in her voice. "This land has endured drought, fire, and blood. It can endure gossip." She didn't reach for his hand, didn't offer any physical comfort. That bridge remained uncrossed, a possibility for the future rather than the present. But she didn't move away. When John shifted slightly closer, their shoulders almost touching as they watched the last light fade from the western sky. "What will you plant?" John asked after a comfortable silence. Claire smiled, thinking of the seeds he had given her, miraculously preserved through the destruction of her home, now waiting in a jar inside the half-built cabin. "Everything," she said simply, "and see what takes root." The following morning, Morgan found them working together in what would become the new garden, clearing stones and turning the soil despite the doctor's orders that John should rest. "Never could follow directions, could you, Mason?" Morgan remarked, dismounting from his horse. John straightened carefully, wiping sweat from his brow. "Learned from the best," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Morgan approached, taking in the progress on the cabin, the freshly turned earth of the garden. "Looks like you're settling in," he observed neutrally. "For now," John said, his tone careful. Morgan nodded, seeming unsurprised. "We're heading out tomorrow. Rumor has it Harlan's partners in Prescott are trying to salvage what they can of the operation. Figured we'd pay them a visit before they get any ideas about expanding this way again." He hesitated, then added, "Could use your gun if you're up for it." Claire felt tension stiffen John's frame beside her, though his expression remained neutral. This was the moment of choice return to the life he knew, the skills he had honed, the men who understood him, or stay and build something new, something uncertain. "My fighting days are done, Caleb," John said quietly but firmly. "But if you ever need a place to rest or information or supplies, you know where to find me." Morgan studied him for a moment, then nodded, reaching out to clasp John's hand. "Take care of yourself, Mason. And this place." His eyes moved to Claire. "It's worth fighting for." "Yes," John agreed, looking not at the land but at Claire. "It is." The next day, Morgan and his men rode out, leaving behind supplies, ammunition, and the promise of return if trouble ever came again. Claire stood with John watching until the dust of their departure faded from the horizon. "Will you miss it?" she asked suddenly. "That life?" John considered the question seriously. "Parts of it," he admitted. "The brotherhood, the clarity of purpose." He looked around at the half-built cabin and the newly turned garden soil, the vast expanse of land that stretched toward the distant mountains. "But this building, instead of destroying, I think I've been searching for this longer than I knew." Claire nodded, understanding more than she had expected to. "It won't be easy," she warned again. "The land is harsh, the work never ends, and She hesitated. "I'm not an easy woman to live with." John's smile was small but genuine. "Good," he said simply. "Easy was never what I wanted." As autumn turned to winter, the new cabin was completed, its stone walls solid against the occasional cold winds that swept down from the mountains. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth, casting warm light over the simple furnishings, some salvaged from the ruins of the old cabin, others newly made by John's capable hands. The garden had yielded a modest harvest before the first frost, including the drought-resistant plants from John's seeds, which had thrived despite the harsh conditions. Claire had carefully collected their seeds for next spring, a promise of continuance of life persisting where it seemed impossible. John's reputation as a former gunman had spread throughout the territory. But rather than bringing trouble, it seemed to keep it at bay. Occasional travelers who stopped at the homestead treated him with cautious respect, and local ranchers who had once looked through Claire as though she were invisible now acknowledged her with polite nods. They didn't speak often of the past of Thomas or of John's role in his death. But the locket hung openly around Claire's neck, no longer a hidden talisman of grief, but a visible reminder of connections that transcended simple categories, like victim and perpetrator past and present. They worked side by side during the days rebuilding fences, tending livestock, preparing for the future. At night they sat before the fire sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes sharing stories, Claire of her childhood in Missouri, John of his travels through the territories. The distance between them narrowed with each passing day, though Claire maintained certain boundaries, certain private griefs that John respected without question. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, Claire rode alone to the small hill where he was buried, as she had done each year since his murder. She carried wildflowers gathered from the valleys where spring came early, placing them carefully on the simple stone marker. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said softly to the grave, "but I think you'd be pleased with how the land looks now. The North Field is finally producing the way you said it would, if we just gave it time. You were right about that, as you were about so many things." She traced the letters of his name carved deep into the stone. "John's staying," she continued. "I don't know for how long. Perhaps forever, perhaps just until the restlessness finds him again. But for now, he's here, and he's helping, and I think you knew something about him that I'm only beginning to understand." The wind stirred her hair gently, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I haven't forgotten you," she whispered. "I never will. But I'm finding my way forward, Thomas. I'm learning to live again, not just survive." When she returned to the cabin at dusk, John was waiting on the porch, respecting her need for privacy on this day, but clearly relieved to see her return safely. He had prepared a simple supper, and they ate together on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Thank you," Claire said suddenly. John looked at her questioningly. "For understanding," she clarified. That today needed to be yours, he finished when she trailed off. I understand. And he did, she realized. He understood grief and guilt and the long, slow process of healing better than most ever could. It was one of the unexpected gifts of their strange bond, a mutual recognition of the darkness each carried, and a shared determination to find light nonetheless. Later, as John prepared to retire to the small room off the main cabin that he had claimed as his own, Claire placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. It was the first time she had initiated contact between them, and they both felt the significance of the gesture. Stay, she said simply. John's eyes searched hers, looking for certainty. Are you sure? Claire nodded. She wasn't ready for everything such an invitation might imply, but she was ready for this step and this acknowledgement that what lay between them had grown into something worth nurturing, worth the risk of further pain. I'm sure, she said. That night, they slept side by side in the cabin's main room, not as lovers, but as companions who had found in each other an unexpected second chance. Outside, the desert bloomed under a canopy of stars, hardy flowers opening their petals to the moonlight, survivors in a land where survival itself was never guaranteed. Spring brought new growth to the land, young shoots pushing through soil that had once seemed barren. Claire and John expanded the garden, adding fruit trees that might take years to bear, but would stand as a testament to faith in the future. Morgan and several of his men stopped by, occasionally bringing news from across the territory and taking shelter when needed. The world around them was changing rapidly. The railroad was expanding westward, bringing new settlements, new people, new ideas about what the territory might become. But on their small patch of hard-won earth, Claire and John continued their careful dance of rebuilding the land, their lives, and the fragile trust that had grown between them. One evening, as summer approached with its promise of both abundance and hardship, they sat together on the porch, watching a distant storm paint the horizon with lightning. John held in his hands a letter that had arrived that morning from the territorial governor's office, an official pardon for his past crimes in exchange for his testimony against Harlan's remaining associates. What will you do with it? Claire asked, watching his face in the fading light. John considered the document. I'm not sure it changes anything, he said honestly. A piece of paper doesn't erase what I've done. No, Claire agreed. But perhaps it acknowledges that you're not that man anymore. She paused. That you're trying to be better. John folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. Is it enough? He asked quietly, and they both knew he wasn't speaking just of the pardon. Claire took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know if anything could ever be enough to balance what was taken. But I do know that what you're doing now, what we're building here, it matters. It's not nothing. She looked out over the land, their land. Now she realized with a start. Not just hers and Thomas's anymore, but hers and John's, too, shaped by their combined labor, their shared vision of what it could become. Maybe that's all any of us can do. She continued thoughtfully. Try to build more than we destroy. Try to leave the world better than we found it, even if just in one small corner. John's hand tightened around hers. That's a generous way of seeing things, he said, echoing words he had spoken to her months ago when they were still strangers to each other. Claire smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I'm learning, she said simply. The storm moved closer, bringing with it the promise of rain's life-giving water for their crops, for the land that had endured so much and continued to flourish despite it all. Neither of them moved to go inside content to watch nature's display together. Their joined hands, a bridge between past and future, between what had been lost and what might yet be found. In the harsh beauty of the territory that had claimed so much from both of them, they had discovered something neither had expected. Not forgiveness exactly, for some wounds ran too deep for that simple balm, but perhaps something equally precious. The possibility of redemption, of second chances of growth in soil that once seemed poisoned by the past. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but someday. And for now, someday was enough.